Chapter 15, the Segolate noun. If you remember back in chapter 10, I told you that generally speaking there's two types of nouns. There's the Segolate nouns and the non-Segolate nouns. And in chapters 10, 11, 12, and even 13 really, we dealt with non-Segolate nouns. But now as we hit chapters 15 and 16, we're going to look at a whole new world of nouns called Segolate nouns. Now these Segolate nouns, of course, derive their name from their characteristic segols, like melech. And this is where the term Segolate noun comes from. And for a Segolate noun, in the singular, the absolute and the construct look alike. So this could be king or king of. And so that's something you want to keep in mind, that the absolute and construct look alike. But Segolate nouns have an interesting history. At least it's interesting if you like Hebrew, and that is that here's the problem. Let me put it in terms of a problem first. You have the Segolate noun, but yet when you attach a pronominal suffix to it, it looks quite a bit different than the Segolate noun. You don't simply take the segols and do something like this. No way. And if we had that, there'd be no problem. We'd all be happy. Let me get rid of this. We'd all be happy, and there'd be no problem. But the real answer is you get this. Malki, as opposed to, like Melachi or something crazy like that. And so how do we get from Melech to Malki? And so that's why we want to discuss the history of Segolate nouns, so that you have an understanding of how this difference between the form and the absolute and construct looks in comparison to the forms with pronominal suffixes. Well, if you again look at section 2, I give you the development of the Segolate noun. And the first form of the Segolate noun looks like this. This is what it would have looked like back in proto-world. And here's your mem, lam, and your kaf, and then you have this ending here. Hebrew nouns used to end in these mems. You still see that in certain forms like omnam, but also most frequently you'll see this this mem in a masculine plural absolute form. Remember the box for that? It ended with a mem. Well, that's what it is. Hebrew nouns used to end in mems. And then this vowel here, the patach, was really a case ending. Like in Greek and in Latin they have case endings. And Hebrew originally had case endings also, which is true also in Akkadian and in Arabic. And so this is a case ending here in the Hebrew. But over time what happened is that the case ending, the memation, the mem at the end, disappeared. And then it wasn't too long, I guess, after that, that the case ending, the vowel, also dropped off, and we ended up with a form that looked like this. You had one vowel, and then you had two, as it were, silent schwas. Hebrew has an intolerance for this type of combination of a word ending in two silent schwas. There's cases in which they will allow such a thing, but in a lot of nouns, they don't like it. And so when this situation happened, the form was, let's say, in crisis. And Hebrew didn't like to have something like this. And so what they decided to do is insert a vowel here. And what they inserted was a segol. They inserted a segol, a little vowel to help the pronunciation. They didn't want to say malch. And so they inserted this segol. But the segol didn't behave itself. It's very similar to what's happened in the South. If you drive down the interstates and you see the stuff called kudzu. The kudzu is an interesting thing in the South. It takes over the forest and kills trees and so forth. And kudzu was brought in this country. There's various stories about how it came. One story goes that people had these kudzu vines for their aquariums. And so when they decided to throw away their aquarium after their fish died, they would take these things and throw them in the backyard, and these things all of a sudden started taking off and becoming the great kudzu. Whether that story is correct or not, I don't know. That's one of the stories behind kudzu. But what it is you brought that over here, and once you brought it over here, it started just taking over. It's like bringing certain animals in also. You bring an animal in to get rid of some problem we perceive, and all of a sudden it gets rid of that problem, but then it starts making other problems. And before long, you get Godzilla. And so that's exactly what we have here. The Segoles, like kudzu, starts going everywhere, and before long, guess what you get? You get the double Segole, because you brought that Segole in there like kudzu in order to solve a problem, let's say, or bringing certain animals in to kill certain problems. And before long, they're out of control and they're spreading everywhere. And now you have an assimilation. So now instead of saying Malech, it's all of a sudden Melech. And so the Segoles have taken over this form. And that's exactly how we get the absolute and the construct form. We get it through the invasion of the Segoles here. And as they take over. Well, when we see that situation, now when we look at a form with a pronominal suffix, we see that really this looks very much like the original form. And with a pronominal suffix attached, you never had the problem of that clustering of consonants. And by that I mean we never had this situation. This situation would never arise, having two consonants with silent schwa, because again you had some type of vowel or vocal schwa here. And by doing that, that prevented the form from having that consonantal cluster that brought in the Segole, which would later take over everywhere. And so what you see is a form that's far more original with the pronominal suffixes. And if you remember, with the feminine forms, when we were attaching pronominal suffixes onto feminine nouns, remember how it also preserved the original tav, the original feminine tav, and so forth. And that's what we're getting here. So when we look at a Segolate noun, the form to explain is really not the ones with the pronominal suffix. That's just like the original forms. No clustering of consonants where you need to add some Segole in there. The problem forms are the forms that you learn as your absolute and construct forms in the singular. Those are the difficult ones. But these are the easier forms when it comes to the original form. And so with Segolate nouns, you can have three varieties. You can have one that has a patach under the first root letter, or we'll call it R1. You have another one in which you have a hirik under R1, and yet you have another variety where you have a holum with R1, Kodesh. And so those are the three varieties. But the original form of this, by the way, the original form would be like this. Here's the original form. That would match the other ones like Malch, Sifr, and now you have this with, again, this would be a Kametz Chatuf going back to Kodesh. And so you have three varieties. Now, these three varieties you can only know by memorization. And so when I have you attach a pronominal suffix, many times the question will be, well, what's the vowel here? And I'll tell you that. I'll give you like an A in brackets, which would tell you, okay, I need to put a patach here. Or if I put an I here, okay, there needs to be a hirik here. Or if I put an O, I need a kametz chatuf. So I will give you that information for which flavor you're dealing with. And again, if you look at 15.3, I give you that. I show you the absolute and construct form of king, and then of book, and then of holiness. And then I give you what I call the base form. And that base form is the original form with the consonantal cluster that you have, those two silent schwas at the end, because you've got to restore it to that original form in order to add the pronominal suffix. And basically, once you restore it to its base form, the adding of pronominal suffixes in the singular is not very difficult. And so look at my king. Of course, you would have something like this as its base form. And so when you add the box, all you do is you'll add the box, put the accent, and here's your pronominal suffix. This is a silent schwa, and this would be God kafad letter, so I need a lane there, dagesh lane. And now I simply crunch the rules. This is closed unaccented. Hebrew says leave it alone. It's not pretonic open, it's closed unaccented, and so that's your answer. So really, in the singular, there's very little difficulty in attaching the pronominal suffix as long as you know the base form. So for the singular, the problems are few. When you get to the plural, however, it's a little more difficult. And so if you look at section 4 of chapter 15, I talk about plural Segolate nouns. First of all, we talk about the absolute and the construct. Now, what you would expect for the plural ending, of course, you'd get a box, an accent, and you'd get this eem ending. That would be what you would expect for the ending. And really, what I would expect is something like this. Malkim is what I would expect. And again, there's that old Segolate form, but this is not what you get. What you get instead is something that looks very similar to the devar pattern, like devarim. That's exactly what this looks like. It looks like the devar pattern has invaded. Of course, there is another explanation, which I mentioned in a footnote, footnote 6 there, that some people think that the original form in the plural of seglates was tu patachs. Well, that would work too, because that would give you that by the rule. So you could work it that way too. But also, it's very possible that segulates, both in the singular and plural, went back to a form with just one vowel. And these plural forms are really assimilating to the very popular forms of davarim. And so perhaps that's the way we could possibly to describe this. And so anyway, this is the form. And so you have to recognize that in the masculine plural absolute, it follows a devar pattern. When we come to the construct, again, I'll tell you what I would expect. I would expect, when we put the box on, for something that would look like this. And that is almost the proper form. That's very close to the proper form. The only difference is the dagesh lene and the kaf. They will, in the plural, they will not have the dagesh lene in a begad kafat letter in the third position, the third root position, as you see here. So we really have right now two patterns for the plural. This pattern we will call the plural Segolate pattern, because it's very similar to the singular Segolate pattern with one little difference, and that's the lack of the dagesh lene in R3 if it's a begad kafad. If that's not a begad kafad, it looks absolutely the same. And you have a devar pattern. So in the masculine plural absolute, it follows a devar pattern like davarim. But in the masculine plural construct, it follows what we call a plural Segolate pattern without dagesh lene in a begad kafat letter, if you have one in the R3 position. And so those are the basic three patterns that we must watch out for as we're dealing with that. So now you want to look at the chart that you have in section 5. In section 15.5, you have a chart. And I know you cannot read all of the chart I'm showing you right now in fine detail, but this chart, again, is very much like the chart you have in section 15.5, and I want to point out a couple of things. Again, when we're dealing with the plural absolute, it really follows a devar pattern. And devarim, you see here, and you'd say malachim, you see. And for the plural construct, we're going to follow a plural seglet pattern without dagesh lene in R3. And so you say malche. When you attach pronominal suffixes on a plural seglet noun, going from 1 CS down to 1 CP, from 1 to 1, you're going to follow the devar pattern. So basically what you're going to do is restore 2 patachs, one under the mem, one under the lamed, or one patach under R1, another patach under R2, put your pronominal suffix of plural nouns on, and then crunch the rules. And again, it's going to look very similar to devar. And then the last 4 forms, they're going to go the direction of the plural seglet pattern without dagesh lene in R3. And so again, if you notice those, in R3 you have the begad kafad letter. It has no dagesh lene there, as you would have in the singular seglet pattern. And again, though, it looks more like the singular seglet pattern. And just to give you one other chart that explains this, again, in the singular, we have what's called a singular seglet pattern. And you see that by malki, malkacha, malkech, and so forth. When you get over into the plural, however, for your 1 to your 1, you're going to run a devar pattern like melachai. You see here, this pattern of vowels, again, is very similar to what you would see with devarai. Same thing. But when you get to the last 4 forms, your seconds and your thirds of your plural, then again you're going to go back to a plural seglet pattern, no dagesh in R3. So that's what you've got to remember. You've got 3 options when you're dealing now with seglet nouns, when you're going to put a pronominal suffix on. And that's going to be your first step in putting pronominal suffixes on seglet nouns. Which pattern are you going to follow? That's step 1. Which pattern are you going to follow? Is it the singular seglet pattern? Is it the devar pattern? Or is it the plural seglet pattern? Those are your 3 patterns that you have to know. And that will be your first step. And so that's very, very important. Okay. If you look at 15.6, you'll see examples of plural seglet nouns in the absolute, in the construct, and with pronominal suffixes. And again, this time let's look at the word sefer, the one in the middle, sefarim. You can see again in the absolute plural that you get a devar-looking pattern. But when you go to the construct, you go to the plural seglet pattern. And then when you go from 1 to 1, you again go back to the devar pattern. And then when you go with your 2s and 3s at the bottom, the last 4 forms, you go back to a plural seglet pattern. One thing I do need to point out, and that is the word kodesh. That's the 3rd one there. Notice that under the kof, for your absolute, you would expect a vocal schwa. But for whatever reason, you get another kametz chatuf. And apparently that kametz chatuf is substituting for a chetef kametz chatuf. And so, again, you have to watch out for that. You have a metheg there, but again, that doesn't really affect much of anything, but I put it there for you. But when you come down to your construct form, you get code she. Again, there's the plural seglet pattern. And then again, from the 1 to the 1, you get a devar pattern, but instead of getting a vocal schwa under the kof, you get that irregular kametz chatuf. But again, it is following a devar pattern with that exception of the kametz chatuf. And then again, the last 4 forms run a plural seglet pattern, as you see there, code shechem, code shechen, and so forth. And so again, you want to keep those in mind. And if you know that, then the seglet, putting pronominal suffixes onto seglet nouns is not a big problem, but indeed you want to be careful that you know the 3 patterns and which form goes into which pattern. Okay, so you need to keep that in mind. Now in section 7, we're actually attaching the pronominal suffixes to seglet nouns. And again, we're going to have a 3-step process. And the first process, of course, is which pattern are we going to follow? Are we going to follow a singular seglet pattern, a devar pattern, or a plural seglet pattern? That's got to be the first question. And you've got to know that chart back on 15.5 in order to determine that. And also you got to remember the singular seglet, but that's okay. The second step is attach the appropriate box, and then finally we'll work the rules of syllables. And so the example I give you is a 3ms suffix on the singular of melech. And so what I give you is melech like this, and then I give you the A over here, which is telling you that the original vowel under R1 is a batach. That's what I'm telling you. And I tell you it's a singular of melech, so this has got to follow the singular seglet pattern. And so the singular seglet pattern that you want to write down is this. There is the singular seglet pattern, that base form. And now we're doing a 3ms suffix. And so that's the next step. And so we'll get rid of this silent schwa because now we want to attach this here. And of course it's a singular seglet pattern, so we will have a dagish lene if there's a begad kafat. Now we work the rules, and there's nothing really to work because that is closed and accented. Hebrew won't touch it, and so that's our answer for this one. Okay, the next one is a 3ms suffix on the plural of melech. And again, we have this. Now, again, the first step is we've got to determine which pattern are we going to follow. Are we going to follow the singular seglet pattern? No, because we're doing the plural of melech. So we're down to 2 patterns. It's either going to be a devar pattern or a plural seglet pattern. One of those 2. Well, if you remember from your 1CS all the way down to your 1CP, that follows a devar pattern. And so really, this is not going to do us any good this time, because we're going to run a devar pattern. Well, remember devar, we would have 2 patachs representing the 2 kametzes back in the proto-world. And so we'll do the same thing here. We'll do the exact same thing. And now what we need to do is we need to attach a 3ms suffix, and it's plural, so we've got to use the suffixes of the plural noun, which is this. And now what we want to do is crunch the rules. And again, we're dealing with a devar pattern. So this lamed is in the pretonic open, we lengthen, and this mem is in the originally open pro-pretonic. We'll reduce that to a vocal schwa, and so that's the answer we get, melachav. Okay, that's it for the seglet nouns. And so now read the chapter carefully. This is a difficult chapter. Read it carefully. And then do the questions and make sure you have those completely mastered, and then go on to the vocabulary and the drills.